Elena was on her knees. The thin, industrial-grade carpet, a landscape of faded grey and indeterminate stains, pressed into her kneecaps through the cheap fabric of her trousers. Each synthetic fibre seemed to be a tiny, sharp accusation. Outside, a November rain was washing the city clean, but in here, in the stale, recycled air of the Sterling Corp fourth-floor bullpen, the world was grimy and unforgiving. Her bag had fallen, its contents spilling in a pathetic semicircle around her, a half-peeled orange, a tube of lip balm, a single, bright purple crayon that had escaped from the small box she kept for Sophia. Her daughter had a fever. A real one, 1,024 degrees, a number that had blazed on the cheap digital thermometer like a prophecy of doom. The daycare had called at 10, their voice a practiced, gentle regret that did nothing to soften the blow. Elena had flown, a frantic prayer in her heart, scooped up her daughter's limp, hot body, and deposited her with Mrs. Gable down the hall, a woman whose kindness was as thin and unreliable as a winter sun. Then she had flown back, breaking every speed limit, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She'd been 5 minutes late returning. 5 minutes. A lifetime. And her supervisor, a man named Marcus Thorne, was firing her publicly. He stood over her, his portly frame blocking the fluorescent lights, casting her in a deep and humiliating shadow. His voice, a reedy tenor that always grated on her nerves, was pitched for performance. He wanted an audience. He had one. Dozens of pairs of eyes, her colleagues, were fixed on her, a horrifying tableau of pity, morbid curiosity, and the secret, shameful relief that it wasn't them. "This is the 3rd time this month, Elena," Thorne said, his words slick with theatrical disappointment. He picked up the purple crayon with the tips of his fingers, as if it was something contagious. "Little artistic endeavors on company time?" "My daughter," she began, her voice a raw whisper. The sound was swallowed by the vast, humming silence of the office. "Ah, yes. The daughter," he said, dropping the crayon. It rolled under a nearby desk. "We are all very sympathetic to your situation. But this is a business, not a charity. We require reliability, punctuality, commitment." Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown at her. "Qualities you seem to be lacking." He laughed then, a short, barking sound that echoed in the cavernous room. "The truth is, Elena, you're replaceable. We all are, of course. But some of us," he gestured vaguely at his own chest, "are a little harder to replace than others." She didn't beg. Not with words. But her entire posture was a plea. Her hands, clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her bowed head, the tears she refused to let fall but that burned hot behind her eyes. "Please, my daughter needs medicine. The rent is due. Please, I'll do better." The words screamed in the confines of her skull but died on her lips. Begging was a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford, it never worked, and it cost you the last shred of your dignity. She didn't notice the stranger in the corner, seated in the visitor's chair by the empty executive office. Had she looked, she would have seen a man who seemed carved from shadow and stillness, a stark contrast to the frantic, anxious energy of the room. He wore a suit of such impeccable tailoring and dark material that it seemed to drink the harsh office light, leaving only an impression of height and broad shoulders. His face was a study in ageless geometry, all sharp angles and severe grace, and his eyes, dark and profoundly deep, missed nothing. They were not on Marcus Thorne, the preening little tyrant. They were on her. He watched the way her spine remained straight even as she knelt, the tremor in her hands as she gathered the scattered contents of her life into a worn leather bag. He saw the fire of her unshed tears. He saw the purple crayon disappear under the desk. Damon, lord of the Volkov domain, king of a court that had seen the rise and fall of Rome, was observing his newest, most mundane acquisition. He had bought Sterling Corp for its data infrastructure, a trivial piece in a much larger, centuries-old game. He had intended to spend an hour here, assessing the leadership, before vanishing back into the echelons of true power. But he found himself utterly captivated by this small, brutal human drama. He had witnessed executions, coronations, the fall of empires. He had seen generals beg for their lives and queens for their kingdoms. But the quiet, desperate strength of this one woman, kneeling on a stained carpet for the simple, sacred purpose of caring for her child, resonated in the vast, silent chambers of his chest in a way nothing had for a very, very long time. Marcus Thorne had called her replaceable. Damon, who understood the true nature of value better than any man alive, knew he was witnessing something utterly unique. And the petty cruelty that sought to crush it ignited a cold, ancient anger within him. Elena finally got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She did not look at anyone. She fixed her gaze on the elevator doors at the far end of the room, a silver portal to escape. She walked toward them, her back straight, each step a testament to a will that refused to completely break. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic click of her worn heels on the linoleum. The man in the corner watched her go, his expression unreadable, and then, with a slow, deliberate grace, his gaze shifted to Marcus Thorne, who was still preening in the center of his little stage. And in Damon's ancient, knowing eyes, a verdict was passed. The walk home was a blur of rain-streaked bus windows and the suffocating weight of failure. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt like a cage. It was small, on the third floor of a walk-up with perpetually flickering hallway lights and the lingering smell of other people's cooking. But it was clean, and it was hers, and Sophia's crayon drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a gallery of lopsided suns and smiling stick figures that were usually the first thing to greet her. Tonight, they looked like accusations. Sophia was asleep on the sofa, her small face flushed with fever, a damp cloth askew on her forehead. Mrs. Gable had left a note on the counter. She was quiet. Didn't want soup. Call me if you need anything, dear. The words a small, inadequate bandage on a gaping wound. Elena sank into the armchair opposite the sofa, the cheap fabric groaning under her weight. The rain beat a frantic tattoo against the window pane. She listened to the sound of her daughter's breathing, shallow and raspy, and the sound of her own heart, a slow, heavy thud in the echoing silence of her life. This was the quiet terror she lived with every day, the monster that lived just under the floorboards, the precariousness of it all. One missed paycheck, one sick child, one petty tyrant of a boss, and the whole fragile structure of her life could collapse. She pulled out her phone, the screen a cruel, bright rectangle in the dim room. She opened her banking app. The number displayed there was a joke. A pittance. Not enough for rent, not enough for the new prescription of antibiotics Sophia needed, certainly not enough for groceries to last the week. It was a number that spelled out, in stark, digital clarity, the word impossible. She closed her eyes, and the scene from the office replayed itself. The faces. Thorne's sneer. The spilled contents of her bag. The feeling of the carpet on her knees. The word. Replaceable. It was a brand, seared into her. She had spent years trying to be essential, to be reliable, to be so good at her job that they couldn't afford to lose her. She had built a wall of competence around herself and her daughter, and in 5 minutes, Marcus Thorne had demolished it with a laugh. Sleep did not come. She dozed in the chair, waking at every small cough from the sofa, her own body a tightly coiled spring of anxiety. She watched the city lights blur and shift through the rain-slicked glass, feeling profoundly, cosmically alone. Each headlight that swept across her wall felt like a searchlight, seeking her out in her failure. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent spectator to her own impending ruin. The morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a reluctant, grey lightening of the sky. The rain had softened to a miserable drizzle. Sophia's fever had broken in the night, her temperature now a blessedly normal 987. It was the first piece of good news in what felt like a lifetime, a tiny island of relief in an ocean of despair. Elena made her toast and coffee, the familiar ritual a small, comforting anchor in the storm. She was composing a list in her head, call the temp agency, update her resume, sell the few pieces of jewelry she had from her grandmother. The list was grim, a litany of dwindling options. Her phone rang at precisely 9 o'clock. The caller ID was the main line for Sterling Corporation. Her stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. Had they forgotten something? Did they need her to come in and sign papers? Did they want to humiliate her further? She almost let it go to voicemail, but some weary instinct made her answer. Elena, she said, her voice thin. Ms. Rossi. This is Catherine from Human Resources. The voice was different. Not the usual chirpy, impersonal HR drone. This voice was low, respectful, and laced with a distinct thread of nervousness. I'm calling on behalf of the new ownership. Ownership? Elena's mind was a fog. Yes, Sterling Corp was acquired yesterday. The transition was immediate. There have been some significant changes to the senior management structure. A pause, freighted with meaning. Mr. Thorne is no longer with the company. Elena sank onto the edge of her sofa, the phone slick in her hand. What? He was dismissed this morning. Effectively, immediately. Catherine cleared her throat. Ms. Rossi, the new CEO, Mr. Volkov, has personally reviewed your file. And the events of yesterday afternoon. Another, longer pause. He was extremely displeased with Mr. Thorne's conduct. We have been instructed to offer you our sincerest apologies for the unprofessional and unacceptable manner of your dismissal. This had to be a dream. A cruel, elaborate prank. I don't understand. Mr. Volkov was impressed by your performance record. Your loyalty to the company despite difficult circumstances. He believes you have been profoundly undervalued. Catherine took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. We would like to offer you the position of head of accounts. It was Mr. Thorne's position. The salary is $120,000 a year, plus performance bonuses and a comprehensive benefits package, effective immediately. The number hung in the air between them, so vast and impossible it felt like a fiction. It was more than double what she had been making. It was a number that meant safety. It meant medicine and food and a future for Sophia that wasn't shadowed by her mother's constant, grinding fear. It meant she could breathe. Tears, the ones she had refused to shed in that office, finally came. They streamed down her face, hot and silent. Is this a joke? She whispered. I assure you, Ms. Rossi, it is not, Catherine said, her voice softening with what sounded like genuine relief. The offer is real. We would need you to start as soon as possible. Today, if you can. Elena looked over at Sophia, who was now sitting up on the sofa, watching a cartoon on the small television, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked at the peeling paint on the apartment walls, at the stack of bills on the coffee table. Then she looked out the window at the grey, drizzling world that had, in the space of a single phone call, utterly and irrevocably changed. Yes, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Yes. I can be there in an hour. From his penthouse office, a silent, glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the sprawling city, Damon ended the call with his head of security. The details were confirmed. Marcus Thorne was gone. Not just from Sterling Corporation. Damon had made a few quiet inquiries, pulled a few invisible strings. Thorne's reputation was now irrevocably tainted by whispers of embezzlement and fraud, untrue, but impossible to disprove. He would find it very difficult to find another management position in the city. Or any city. It was a small, precise exertion of power, like a surgeon excising a tumor. Neat. Final. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, the grey morning light doing nothing to diminish the vibrant, living tapestry of the metropolis below. He had stood in such high places for centuries, watching the world of mortals churn and boil beneath him. Their lives were so brief, so frantic, their passions like flashes of lightning in a long, slow dusk. He had long ago grown weary of their petty ambitions, their predictable cruelties. He had retreated into the quiet, cold eternity of his own existence, managing his vast, hidden empire with a detached, intellectual curiosity. Then, yesterday, he had walked into that sterile, soulless office, a place of fluorescent lights and quiet desperation, and he had seen her. Elena Rossi. On her knees. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her. She was not a queen or a warrior or a genius. She was a mother, fighting a desperate, silent war for her child. And in her quiet refusal to shatter, he had seen a strength that humbled kings. He had seen the raw, unyielding power of love, an emotion he had only ever read about in books or observed from a great, lonely distance. He had felt an old, long-dormant instinct stir within him. Protection. It was a fierce, possessive, and utterly illogical impulse. This woman was nothing to him. A fleeting mortal, a name in a file. But the image of her kneeling, surrounded by the pathetic, scattered artifacts of her life, was now seared into his memory. He had seen the way Thorn looked at her, the casual disdain, the pleasure he took in her humiliation. And Damon had felt an anger so cold and pure it was almost serene. It was the anger of a king who sees one of his own subjects being tormented by a fool. And though she did not know it, from the moment he laid eyes on her, Elena Rossi had become one of his. He had spent a few hours last night going through her file. Not just her employee record, but everything. Her credit history, her rental agreements, her daughter's school records. He learned her story in a series of cold, hard data points that painted a picture of relentless struggle. A failed marriage. A mountain of student debt. A series of low-paying jobs. Late fees and overdraft charges. And through it all, perfect attendance at every parent-teacher conference for Sophia Rossi, age 6. A note from Sophia's teacher described Elena as a deeply caring and involved parent. He found the daycare center's report on Sophia's fever. He cross-referenced it with the company's health insurance plan, a pathetic, high-deductible policy that would have barely covered the cost of the doctor's visit, let alone the prescription. He made another call. The company's benefits were to be upgraded, across the board. The new plan would be the best available. And it would be retroactive. Sophia's recent illness would be covered in its entirety. It was a simple matter of allocating funds, a drop in the ocean of his resources. No one would ever know it was for her. It would be seen as a gesture of goodwill from the new, benevolent ownership. He thought of her face when she received the call from HR. The disbelief. The dawning hope. He could almost feel it, a faint echo across the city, a small, warm light in the grey morning. He had changed her life with a few words, a flick of his immense power. It was a simple, satisfying exercise. But it felt different this time. It wasn't about strategy or control. It was about correcting an injustice. It was about lifting up the woman who had refused to break. He turned from the window, his gaze falling on his desk. Beside a stack of acquisition reports and market analyses, there was a single, purple crayon. He had retrieved it last night after everyone had gone home, a small, vibrant piece of her world left behind in the grey landscape of his. He picked it up, his long, pale fingers closing around the waxy cylinder. It was a fragile, insignificant thing. But in his hand, it felt like an anchor, tethering him to a world he had long ago forgotten how to touch. Walking back into the Sterling Corp office was one of the most surreal experiences of Elena's life. The air, which yesterday had been thick with her humiliation, was now charged with a different kind of tension. As she walked through the bullpen, conversations ceased. Heads lifted from monitors. The eyes that followed her were no longer filled with pity, but with a potent cocktail of awe, confusion, and fear. She was a ghost returned from the grave, and not just returned, but resurrected into a position of power. Catherine from HR, a woman who had never given Elena more than a polite, dismissive nod, met her by the elevators. She was flustered, her smile tight with anxiety. "Ms. Rossi. Welcome back. We're so glad you decided to stay with us." The lie was so blatant it was almost funny. "Thank you, Catherine. Your new office is ready. This way." She was led not to a cubicle, but to the corner office. Marcus Thorne's office. The one with the large window that overlooked the city, a view he had lauded over them all. The nameplate on the door, a gleaming brass rectangle, already read, Elena Rossi, Head of Accounts. Her old desk, a small grey island in the sea of cubicles, was starkly, conspicuously empty. The office itself was an exercise in corporate blandness, a large mahogany desk, a black leather chair, a generic abstract painting on the wall. But to Elena, it felt like a palace. The chair didn't squeak. The desk was big enough to hold her paperwork, a cup of coffee, and a picture of Sophia without everything being precariously stacked. And the window. She walked over to it, placing her hand on the cool glass. From here, the city didn't look menacing. It looked manageable. Full of possibility. A small, exquisitely arranged bouquet of white tulips sat on the corner of the desk. The card simply read, "Welcome. V. Volkov." The new owner. The mysterious benefactor who had, for reasons she couldn't possibly fathom, decided to pluck her from obscurity and ruin and place her on this strange, terrifying throne. Later that day, she saw him. He was walking down the main corridor with the company's COO, deep in conversation. He was the man from the corner. She was sure of it. The same impossible stillness, the same dark, impeccably tailored suit. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with volume or gesture. It was an intrinsic quality, like the density of a star. He must have felt her gaze, because he paused mid-sentence and turned his head. His eyes met hers through the glass wall of her new office. They were dark, so dark they seemed to hold the night sky in them, and for a fleeting second, she felt an unnerving jolt, a sense of being seen, truly and completely, in a way that stripped away all pretense. There was no pity in his expression, no condescension. There was only a calm, steady recognition. He gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned back to his conversation, the moment broken. Elena's hand flew to her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was him. He had been there. He had seen everything. The knowledge was both terrifying and, in a strange way, validating. He hadn't just read a file. He had been a witness. And he had passed judgment not on her, but on Thorn. The first few weeks were a blur of meetings, spreadsheets, and long hours. Elena threw herself into the work, driven by a fierce determination to prove that his faith in her, however inexplicable, was not misplaced. She was good at this. She was organized, meticulous, and fair. She dismantled the petty, fear-based systems Thorn had put in place, replacing them with efficiency and clear communication. Her team, initially wary of her, slowly began to relax. The oppressive atmosphere of the department began to lift, replaced by a quiet, productive hum. She could afford things now. Not just the essentials, but small joys. She bought Sophia the expensive art set she'd been coveting, the one with 100 different colored pencils. She bought herself a new coat, a deep blue wool that felt like a shield against the world. She paid her rent a month in advance, a simple act that felt like the height of luxury. The constant, grinding anxiety that had been her companion for years began to recede, leaving in its place a quiet, unfamiliar sense of peace. She saw Mr. Volkov periodically. He was a remote, powerful figure, usually glimpsed at a distance. But occasionally, their paths would cross in the hallway or the elevator. He was always polite, his greetings formal. Ms. Rossi, but his eyes always held that same unnerving, knowing intensity. And sometimes, he would ask, his voice a low, quiet rumble, "How is your daughter?" The first time he said her name, it stopped Elena in her tracks. They were alone in the elevator, the soft hum of the machinery filling the silence. "How is Sophia?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the glowing floor numbers. Elena stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors. She's well. Thank you." A beat of silence. "How did you know her name?" His reflection offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I make it my business to know the people who are important to my company." The doors slid open on his floor. "Have a good evening, Elena." He used her first name, the sound of it in his deep voice both intimate and unsettling. He stepped out, leaving her alone in the small, descending box, her mind reeling. He wasn't just a benefactor. He was an observer. He was watching her. The thought should have been frightening, but strangely, it wasn't. It felt protective. The true nature of his quiet attention became undeniable 3 months into her new job. It was a Tuesday, and a ferocious winter storm had descended on the city, turning the evening commute into a nightmare of ice and gridlock. Her car, a 10-year-old sedan that was more rust than metal, chose that exact moment to die. It coughed, sputtered, and went silent in the echoing concrete expanse of the 3rd level of the company parking garage. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was already late to pick up Sophia from her after-school program. The daycare had a strict policy, $1 for every minute past 6 o'clock. She turned the key again and again, the only response a pathetic, defeated clicking sound. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. She had come so far, and yet here she was, still at the mercy of a broken-down machine, a single point of failure away from disaster. Trouble? The voice came from the shadows behind her. She jumped, whirling around to see Damon Volkov standing there, his hands in the pockets of his long, dark overcoat. Snowflakes melted on the fine wool of his shoulders. He seemed to have materialized from the cold air itself. Mr. Volkov. My car won't start. The admission felt like a confession of her own inadequacy. He didn't say anything. He simply walked to the front of the car, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the oil-stained concrete. He gestured for her to pop the hood. She did, and he leaned over the engine, his expression unreadable in the dim garage light. He didn't touch anything. He just looked, his head tilted in concentration, as if he were listening to a story only he could hear. After a long moment, he straightened up. The alternator, he said, the word sounding absolute, a final diagnosis. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his conversation brief and quiet, spoken in a language she didn't recognize. When he hung up, he looked at her. My driver will be here in 2 minutes. He will take you to your daughter. Leave the car. It will be taken care of. Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. It's not a request, Elena, he said, his voice soft but leaving no room for argument. Your daughter is waiting. Just as he'd said, a sleek, black town car, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies, purred silently up the ramp and stopped beside them. A uniformed driver got out and opened the rear door for her. Dazed, Elena slid into the plush leather interior. It smelled of wealth and quiet efficiency. Thank you, she said through the open window, feeling small and overwhelmed. Damon simply nodded, a dark, motionless figure against the swirling snow. As the car pulled away, she looked back and saw him still standing there, watching her go, a solitary king in a concrete kingdom. The next morning, when she arrived at the garage, her car was parked in its usual spot. A small tag hung from the rearview mirror. She opened the door, her heart sinking at the thought of the bill, and saw a key in the ignition with a note attached. Fully serviced. The charge has been handled. V. She started the car. The engine turned over instantly, humming with a smooth, healthy power it hadn't possessed in years. He had not just fixed the alternator. He had given her a new engine. No, not new. A better one. He had solved her problem, quietly, completely, and without asking for a thing in return. It was an act of kindness so profound, so far beyond the realm of professional courtesy, that it left her breathless. This was something else entirely. And for the first time, she allowed a dangerous, thrilling question to form in her mind. What did he want? The answer, it seemed, was nothing. Or rather, nothing she could define. The weeks turned into months. Winter thawed into a wet, hopeful spring. And the small, quiet gestures continued. They were never grand or public. They were intimate, specific, and always anonymous, though she knew their source. A rare, first-edition copy of The Little Prince, Sophia's favorite book, appeared on her desk, wrapped in plain brown paper. When she mentioned in passing that she was struggling to assemble a bookshelf for Sophia's room, a specialized set of tools was delivered to her apartment from a high-end hardware store, the gift receipt blank. He was learning her. He was paying attention in a way no one ever had. He remembered the name of the obscure English tea she liked and had the company pantry stocked with it. He noticed when she was tired and would quietly delegate one of her less urgent projects to another department head, clearing her schedule without a word. He was a ghost in the machine of her life, a silent, benevolent force making the gears turn more smoothly. And then there was the school play. Sophia had been cast as a tree. It was a role she took with the utmost seriousness, practicing her stillness for hours, her small arms held rigidly out as branches. The play was on a Thursday evening. Elena had a major quarterly report due, and the meeting ran late, a torturous, 2-hour affair of charts and projections. She sat there, smiling and nodding, while inside she was screaming. She was going to miss it. She was going to miss her daughter being a tree. It was the kind of small, heartbreaking failure that defined working motherhood. When the meeting finally broke, she grabbed her coat and ran for the elevator, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. As the doors opened, she almost collided with him. Damon Volkov. He was on his way out as well. In a hurry, Elena, he asked, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her frantic energy. I'm sorry, Mr. Volkov. My daughter's school play. I'm late. I'm going to miss it. The words tumbled out, laced with despair. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he simply said, "Where is the school?" She told him the address, a 20-minute drive in good traffic. He glanced at the elegant, impossibly thin watch on his wrist. "My driver is waiting downstairs. He'll get you there in 10". Before she could protest, he was steering her by the elbow into the elevator, his touch light but firm. "My evening is clear. It's no trouble." The ride was a silent, high-speed blur through the glittering city streets. The driver, a man with the impassive face of a bodyguard, navigated traffic with an almost supernatural skill. They arrived at the school just as the lights in the auditorium were dimming. "Thank you," she breathed, her hand on the door handle. "I don't know how to thank you." "Go," he said, his voice soft. "Don't miss your daughter's performance." She ran, her heels clattering on the linoleum, and slipped into a seat in the back row just as a line of children dressed as woodland creatures shuffled onto the stage. She found Sophia, standing proudly stage left, her arms outstretched, a paper leaf pinned to her brown sweater. A wave of love and relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over Elena. Halfway through the play, during a particularly long song about the changing seasons, Elena's gaze drifted to the double doors at the back of the auditorium. And she saw him. He wasn't in the car. He was standing in the shadows just inside the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway. He wasn't looking at her. His attention was fixed on the stage. He was watching the play. He was watching a group of 6-year-olds in felt costumes sing off-key, and on his face, in the dim, reflected light from the stage, was an expression of quiet, profound concentration. He was watching her daughter, the little tree, with a softness in his eyes that looked almost like longing. Her heart didn't just flutter. It stopped, and then restarted with a painful, powerful jolt. This was not the act of a kind boss. This was not generosity. This was something deeper, something more personal, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He hadn't just helped her. He had shown up. He had borne witness to this small, silly, deeply important moment in her life. In that moment, watching him watch her daughter, Elena Rossi understood that she was, irrevocably and terrifyingly, beginning to fall in love with him. The feeling was a dangerous, unwelcome guest. She had built her life on a foundation of self-reliance, a fortress designed to protect herself and Sophia from the whims of men. Her ex-husband had been charming and unreliable, a man of grand promises and empty gestures. He had taught her that love was a currency that could be devalued overnight, that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. She had sworn off it, choosing the cold safety of solitude over the chaotic vulnerability of a relationship. And now there was Damon Volkov, a man who was the antithesis of her ex-husband. He made no grand promises. His gestures were small, silent, and devastatingly effective. He didn't talk about helping, he simply helped. He didn't ask for her trust, he earned it, day by day, in 100 quiet ways. She tried to fight it. She tried to retreat into the safe, professional distance she had once maintained. She became more formal in her emails, more brisk in their brief conversations. She avoided the break room when she knew he was there, she took the stairs instead of the elevator. It was a foolish, futile act of self-preservation. He seemed to sense her withdrawal immediately. But instead of pulling back himself, he pushed, gently. He didn't use his power or his position. He used the one weapon she was defenseless against, his quiet, unwavering attention. He started leaving his office door open, and their paths would inevitably cross. He began to talk to her, not just about work, but about books, about music, about the city. He asked for her opinion on a new philanthropic initiative the company was launching, a program to fund arts education in underserved schools. He listened to her ideas, his dark eyes fixed on her face, making her feel as though her words were the most important thing in the world. The slow, careful siege of her heart continued. He was patient, a master strategist laying claim to a territory he had no intention of relinquishing. He never once overstepped. He never made an inappropriate comment or a suggestive gesture. The power imbalance between them was a vast, uncrossable chasm, and yet he behaved as if it didn't exist. He treated her not as an employee, but as an equal, a contemporary, a confidant. One rainy Friday evening, she was working late, trying to reconcile a particularly thorny set of accounts. The office was deserted, the only sounds the hum of her computer and the gentle drumming of the rain against the window. She was rubbing her temples, a headache blooming behind her eyes, when he appeared in her doorway. He didn't knock. He just was suddenly there, holding 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing one of the mugs on her desk. It was tea. Her favorite obscure English blend, brewed perfectly, with just a touch of honey, exactly the way she liked it. "You're working late," she said, her voice a little breathless. "So are you." He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, sipping from his own mug, and looked at her. The silence stretched, comfortable and charged. "You've done remarkable work with this department, Elena." "Thank you. I've had a good opportunity." "It wasn't an opportunity," he corrected, his voice low. "It was a restoration. Putting things back where they belonged." His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. Her carefully constructed professional walls crumbled to dust. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why me?" He was silent for a long moment, studying her face. "Because," he said finally, his voice a soft rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room, "in a world of temporary things, you are a person of permanent value. I have a great respect for permanence." He finished his tea, gave her a small, enigmatic smile, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Elena sat at her desk for a long time, the warmth of the mug seeping into her cold hands, his words echoing in the silent office. A person of permanent value. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever seen her like that. She had always been the replaceable one, the temporary one, the one who could be discarded. He saw something else. He saw the part of her that she herself had forgotten existed. And in that moment, she knew she was lost. The fight was over. She had already surrendered. The invitation came the following week, a heavy, cream-colored card left on her desk. It was not an email or a text, but a formal, handwritten note in elegant, archaic script. "Elena, would you do me the honor of having dinner with me on Saturday evening? Damon." He had signed his first name. It felt like a threshold being crossed. She spent 2 days agonizing over her reply, and 3 more agonizing over what to wear. Her wardrobe was practical, built for work and motherhood, not for elegant dinners with mysterious, billionaire CEOs. She finally settled on a simple, deep blue dress she had bought for a wedding years ago, the one nice thing she owned. It was hopelessly inadequate, but it would have to do. He had arranged for his driver to pick her up. The restaurant wasn't one she recognized. It was a small, unmarked brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. When she walked in, she realized why she didn't know it. The entire place was empty, save for a single table set for 2 in the center of the room, bathed in the warm, intimate glow of candlelight. The maître d', a severe-looking man with silver hair, greeted her by name and led her to the table where Damon was waiting. He stood as she approached. He was not wearing a suit, but dark trousers and a soft, cashmere sweater the color of charcoal. The casual attire somehow made him seem even more formidable. "Elena," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You look beautiful." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "The restaurant, it's empty." "I own it," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I wanted us to be able to talk without interruption." The meal was a masterpiece of quiet elegance, course after course of exquisite food she couldn't have named. But the food was secondary. The true main course was the conversation. He asked her about her life, her childhood, her dreams before they had been whittled down by necessity. He listened with an unnerving, absolute focus, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He had a way of asking questions that made her want to tell him everything, to unburden herself of secrets she hadn't even known she was keeping. She told him about growing up in a small town, about her scholarship to the state university, about meeting her ex-husband in a literature class. She told him about the first few years of her marriage, full of hope and promise, and the slow, painful erosion of that hope as his unreliability became a pattern, then a certainty. She spoke of the terror and joy of discovering she was pregnant, and the profound loneliness of raising Sophia on her own. She was laying the entire, unvarnished story of her life before him, and he received it not with judgment or pity, but with a quiet, solemn respect. From his side of the table, Damon watched her, utterly mesmerized. The candlelight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes and turned the simple blue of her dress into a fathomless ocean. He had dined with queens and consorts, with artists and philosophers, with the most powerful and celebrated women of a dozen different ages. None of them had ever captivated him like this. Her honesty was a force of nature, a clear, clean river cutting through the silt of centuries of deceit and flattery that he was used to. With every word she spoke, the truth of what he was weighed more heavily upon him. This beautiful, fragile, impossibly strong connection they were building was founded on a monumental lie of omission. He was a creature of the night, a predator, a king from a forgotten, violent world. He had blood on his hands that was older than the city around them. How could he ask for her trust? How could he accept the gift of her vulnerability, while hiding the most fundamental truth of his existence? The risk was absolute. He had seen mortals react to his kind. He had seen fear, revulsion, blind hatred. He had seen them run screaming into the night. The thought of seeing that fear in Elena's eyes was a physical pain, a cold dread that eclipsed any threat he had ever faced on a battlefield. To lose her now, just as he was finding her, would be a wound from which he might never recover. But to continue to deceive her would be a betrayal so profound it would poison everything. He would not, could not, build a relationship with her on a foundation of lies. He owed her the truth, no matter the cost. When the driver dropped her at her apartment building, he walked her to the door. The rain had started again, a soft, hushed whisper in the darkness. The streetlights cast a halo around them. The air was thick with unspoken things, a current of energy that crackled in the small space between them. She thought he might kiss her. She wanted him to. Her entire body yearned for it, ached for the simple, human connection of a kiss. But he didn't. He stopped before her door, his tall frame shielding her from the drizzle. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch as light as a moth's wing. His skin was impossibly, unnaturally cool, a stark contrast to the heat that was flooding her own. "Thank you for trusting me, Elena," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It was more than gratitude. It was a plea, a premonition, a farewell to the simplicity of what they had been. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of 1,000 years of sorrow and a fragile, nascent hope. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-swept darkness as silently as he had come. She stood there, her fingers pressed to her cheek where he had touched her, a strange and terrible premonition settling in her heart. Something was about to change. 3 nights later, he came to her. There was no call, no warning. A soft, firm knock on her apartment door after Sophia was asleep. When she opened it, he was standing there, his dark overcoat damp with rain, his face pale and grim in the dim hallway light. "Damon," she said, her heart lurching. "Is something wrong? May I come in?" he asked. His voice was strained. "There is something I must tell you." She stepped back, holding the door open. He walked into her small living room, and the space seemed to shrink around him. He was a force of nature contained within 4 walls, a thunderstorm in a teacup. He didn't sit. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. The tension radiating from him was a palpable thing, a physical pressure in the air. "When I first saw you," he began, his voice low, "in that office, I saw a strength I hadn't witnessed in a very long time. A quiet, unyielding dignity in the face of casual cruelty. I found myself compelled to intervene." He turned from the window, but he didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on some point in the middle distance. "I have lived for a very long time, Elena. I have seen civilizations rise from the dust and return to it. I have seen the definition of power change 100 times. But the one constant, the one true, immutable force in this world, is love. The kind you have for your daughter. The kind that makes a person kneel, but never break." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a pain so ancient and profound it stole her breath. "Everything I have done for you, every small gesture, has been a selfish act. I did it because being near you, watching you, has been like standing in the sun after 1,000 years of winter. But the sun can also burn. And I am not a man who can stand in the sun. A cold dread crept up Elena's spine. Damon, what are you talking about? You're scaring me. He took a step closer, his face cast in shadow and the silver light from the window. Elena, I am not what you think I am. I am not human. The words hung in the air, nonsensical, impossible. Her mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Was this a metaphor? Was he ill? Was he part of some strange cult? He saw the confusion in her eyes. He closed the remaining distance between them in a movement so fast it wasn't a movement at all. One moment he was by the window, the next he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the chill radiating from his body. He held up his hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. Do not be afraid. And then he showed her. It wasn't a grand, monstrous transformation. It was a subtle, terrifying shift. The ambient light in the room seemed to dim, to bend around him. His eyes, already dark, became twin pools of absolute night, and in their depths, a faint, predatory light ignited, ancient and cold. The air grew still and heavy, the sounds of the city outside fading into a muffled silence. It was a projection of sheer, overwhelming power, of age beyond human comprehension, of a nature that was fundamentally, irrevocably other. He let the moment hang, then relaxed his will. The room returned to normal, the city sounds rushing back in. He looked weary, vulnerable. Vampire, he said, the word a quiet admission of guilt. That is the word your stories use. Vampire. The word was a cheap prop from a horror movie. It belonged to capes and bats and gothic castles. It did not belong here, in her cramped living room, attached to the man who had watched her daughter be a tree. It did not fit the man who had fixed her car and brought her tea. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Her breath was a knot in her throat. Primal, instinctual fear screamed at her to run, to grab Sophia and flee into the night. But beneath the terror, another part of her mind was working, connecting dots she hadn't even realized were there. His unnatural coolness. His preference for the night. The way he moved with such impossible speed and grace. His old-fashioned, formal speech patterns. The feeling of immense age and power that had always clung to him. It wasn't a lie. It was a truth she had been seeing all along without understanding it. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw past the monster, past the impossible revelation, and saw the man. And what she saw was fear. He was terrified. Not for himself, but of her. Of her reaction. He stood before her, an ancient and powerful king, and he was completely, utterly vulnerable, awaiting her verdict. He had given her all the power. The foundation of trust he had so patiently, so deliberately built over the last year held firm against the earthquake of his confession. Actions, she had always believed, spoke louder than words. His actions had shown her kindness, respect, and a profound, protective tenderness. This new, impossible word could not erase the truth of those actions. Her fear receded, replaced by a strange, sudden clarity. She took a breath, then another. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. The screaming in her head stopped. You showed me who you are, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute certainty in the silent room, long before you told me what you are. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Of all the possible reactions he had braced himself for, screaming, fainting, violence, revulsion, this quiet, radical acceptance was the one he had never dared to imagine. He had existed for more than a millennium. He had been worshipped as a god, hunted as a demon, feared as a monster, and obeyed as a king. But in all that time, no one, not once, had ever simply seen him. They had seen the power, the title, the myth. But this mortal woman, with her fierce heart and her quiet courage, looked past the predator and saw the person. A wave of relief so profound it was painful washed over him, extinguishing the cold fire of 1,000 years of loneliness. The rigid control he had maintained for centuries, the impassive mask of the eternal king, shattered. For a moment, the sheer, crushing weight of his long existence was visible on his face, the weariness, the sorrow, the solitude. He looked not like a monster, but like a man who had been lost in a dark forest for a very, very long time and had just seen the first glimmer of a light in the distance. He didn't move, afraid that any motion would break the spell, that she would reconsider, that the fear would rush back in. "You are not afraid," he stated, his voice raspy with disbelief. "I'm terrified," she admitted honestly, a small, wry smile touching her lips. But not of you. She was afraid of this new, impossible reality, of what it meant for her life, for Sophia. But the man standing before her was not the source of that fear. He was the anchor in it. He finally moved, taking her hand. His skin was as cool as she remembered, but it no longer felt strange. It felt solid. Real. "Ask me," he said. "Ask me anything. There will be no more secrets between us." And so she did. They sat on her worn sofa, the city lights painting patterns on the walls, and she asked. He answered every question with a stark, unsparing honesty. He told her of his human life as a Kievan prince in an age of swords and superstition, of his violent, unwilling transformation on a forgotten battlefield. He spoke of his first century, a blur of bloodlust and confusion, of learning to control the hunger, to master his new nature. He told her of the courts he had built, the empires he had influenced from the shadows, the long, lonely march of years as everyone and everything he had ever known turned to dust. He did not hide the darkness. He spoke of the violence he was capable of, the lives he had taken, the cold necessities of his survival and his rule. But he framed it all within the vast, crushing context of his eternity, and the profound weariness that had settled upon him in the last few hundred years. "I am a king of a dying people," he confessed, his voice low. "My kind fades. We do not adapt well to your modern world of light and information. We have become ghosts, relics. I spend my nights managing assets and trading stocks not for power, but for peace. For the ability to protect what little remains of my world, and to be left alone by yours." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding the weight of his confession. "Until you are the first truly new thing to happen to me in 500 years. Then he made his offer. It was not a demand, not a price for his help or his affection. It was a possibility, laid gently at her feet. He told her of the gift he could give her, the gift of time, of an endless expanse of nights to spend with him. Immortality. "Not now," he said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Perhaps not ever. It is a curse as much as it is a gift. But I want you to know that the choice exists. A future. With me." He paused, his gaze intense, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When you are ready. If you are ever ready. The choice will always, and only, be yours." He was giving her back the one thing the world had always tried to take from her, her agency. After a lifetime of being subject to the whims of others, her ex-husband, her bosses, her financial circumstances, he was offering her the ultimate choice, with no strings attached. It was the most profound gesture of respect she had ever received. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of pearl and rose. He stood, his form seeming to fade slightly in the encroaching daylight. "I must go." She walked him to the door. The night of confessions was over, leaving behind a quiet, fragile dawn. The world felt both terrifyingly new and more real than it had ever been. He paused on the threshold, turning back to her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering for a moment on her temple. "Thank you, Elena," he whispered. And this time, she understood the depth of his gratitude. It was not for her hospitality or her time. It was for her trust. For her courage. For seeing him. He leaned in and pressed a soft, cool kiss to her forehead, a gesture of profound tenderness and respect. And then he was gone. Elena stood in her open doorway, watching the first rays of the sun spill over the rooftops, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of what the day might bring. Their life together began not with a grand passion, but with the same quiet deliberation that had defined their courtship. It was a slow, careful merging of two vastly different worlds. He never stayed the night, vanishing before dawn and reappearing after dusk, a creature of the twilight hours. But his presence became a constant, comforting fixture in her life. He would appear at her door with dinner from some impossibly exclusive restaurant, or simply sit with her while she paid bills, his silent companionship a bulwark against the mundane anxieties of life. He met Sophia properly. He was introduced simply as Damon, a friend of her mother's. He was infinitely patient and gentle with her. He never used his speed or his strength around her. He was just a quiet, calm man who told the most incredible bedtime stories, tales of ancient castles and brave knights and forgotten lands that he spoke of with the vivid authority of an eyewitness. Sophia, in the way of children who sense genuine kindness, adored him instantly. She would draw pictures for him, lopsided portraits of a very tall, smiling man standing next to her and her mother, and he would accept them with a solemn gravity, as if he were being presented with a royal treasure. He would tape them to the wall of his sterile, minimalist penthouse, the only spots of color in a world of glass and steel and shadow. Elena, in turn, was granted glimpses into his world. His home was less an apartment and more a museum, filled with priceless artifacts that he treated with a casual familiarity. A Roman legionary's sword leaned against a bookshelf filled with first editions. A delicate, Ming Dynasty vase held his car keys. He showed her maps of the world from centuries when half the globe was still labeled "Here be dragons." He spoke of historical figures not as names in a book, but as acquaintances, colleagues, or rivals. She learned that his vast corporate empire, Volkov Industries, was a modern facade for an ancient kingdom. It was a way for him to provide for his own kind, the few dozen vampires who remained under his protection, scattered across the globe. He created safe havens, provided resources, and used his immense wealth to ensure they could live peacefully, hidden from a world that would not understand them. She saw the immense burden of his kingship, the endless responsibility, the constant vigilance required to keep his people safe. He was not just a CEO, he was a shepherd of ghosts. And as she grew to understand his world, she grew into her own power. She was no longer Elena Rossi, the single mom who was 5 minutes late. At work, she was a respected and formidable leader. At home, she was a confident mother and the partner of an ancient king. The fear that had once been the background radiation of her life was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet confidence. She learned to navigate his world with the same unshakable dignity she had brought to her own. One evening, he took her to a gathering, a rare meeting with one of his lieutenants, an old and powerful vampire from Paris named Lucien. Lucien was everything Damon was not: flamboyant, arrogant, and openly disdainful of mortals. He greeted Elena with a look of bored contempt, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. "A pet, Damon?" Lucien sneered in French, assuming Elena would not understand. "How quaint. Does she do tricks?" Before Damon could react, before the cold, terrifying rage could gather in his eyes, Elena stepped forward. "Je ne suis pas un animal de compagnie," she said, her own French, learned in a high school classroom years ago, clear and steady. "I am not a pet." She met the ancient vampire's shocked gaze without flinching. "And I would advise you to remember that. Damon may be your king, but he is my partner. And you will show me the same respect you show him." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucien stared at her, his centuries of arrogance warring with his surprise. Damon stood beside her, his expression a mixture of shock, pride, and profound love. He had been ready to tear Lucien apart for the insult, but she had not needed his protection. She had fought her own battle, with her own weapons, courage and dignity. In that moment, she was not a fragile human in a world of monsters. She was a queen in her own right. Lucien, after a long, tense moment, gave her a stiff, grudging bow. Respect had been demanded, and it had been given. From that night on, their partnership was forged on a new level. He was the king of the shadows, and she was his anchor to the world of light. They were two halves of a whole, his ancient wisdom and power balanced by her warmth, her humanity, her unyielding moral compass. Years passed. They unfolded with the gentle, steady rhythm of a life well lived. Sophia grew from a little girl into a bright, curious teenager, then a thoughtful young woman. She knew Damon was different, that he was allergic to the sun and never seemed to age, but she accepted him as a permanent, beloved part of her family, a quiet, steady presence who had always been there to offer advice, help with her history homework, or simply listen. Elena aged. It was a slow, graceful process. Silver threads appeared in her dark hair, Fine lines bloomed around her eyes and mouth like the petals of a flower. She wore them with pride. They were a map of her life, of every laugh, every worry, every moment of joy with her daughter. But beside her, Damon remained unchanged, a fixed point in the turning world, his face as ageless as a marble statue. The contrast between her mortality and his eternity was no longer a philosophical concept, it was a physical reality they lived with every day. It was the unspoken guest at their dinner table, the silent third person in their bed. He had never mentioned his offer again. He had given her the choice, and he respected her enough to let her live her life without the pressure of it. But it was always there, a quiet, waiting possibility. One autumn evening, Sophia was away at college, her empty room a silent testament to the swift passage of time. Elena and Damon were sitting in the living room of the beautiful, comfortable house they now shared, a house with a garden and a swing set, a house that had truly become a home. Elena was looking through an old photo album, her fingers tracing the faded image of a 6-year-old Sophia in a tree costume. She looked from the photograph to her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. She saw the woman she had become, happy, secure, loved. And she saw the silver in her hair, the gentle softening of her skin. She then looked at Damon, who was watching her with that same, steady, loving gaze he'd had since the beginning. He was exactly the same. Perfect. Eternal. And a deep, profound ache settled in her heart. Not of fear, but of love. She had lived a full, wonderful human life. She had raised her daughter. She had found a love that was deeper and truer than anything she had ever imagined. She was not afraid of growing old, of the natural end that awaited her. But the thought of leaving him, of their story having an end, was an unbearable sorrow. She wanted more time. Not to escape death, but to embrace life. More years of his quiet companionship, more conversations in the dark, more moments of simply being together. She was not running from an ending. She was choosing to continue the story. She closed the photo album and placed it on the coffee table. She turned to him, her heart full, her mind clear and certain. "I'm ready," she said. The two words were all it took. They were quiet, but they resonated in the room with the force of a vow. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his ancient eyes welling with 1,000 emotions, the sorrow of the human life she was choosing to leave behind, the profound, overwhelming joy of the eternity they would now have together. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face, his cool thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. In his gaze, she saw their future, an endless expanse of nights, of shared secrets and quiet understanding. It would not always be easy. His world was still shadowed and dangerous, and eternity was a long time. But they would face it together. He leaned forward, and this time, his kiss was not on her forehead. It was on her lips, a seal and a promise. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, abiding love, a joining of two souls who had found each other across the chasm of time and nature. The narrative of her life did not end here. It was simply turning a new page, to a chapter that would never end. She was Elena Rossi, who had once knelt on a dirty carpet, begging silently for a life that was just out of reach. But she never begged for anything again. Every choice, from this moment forward, was her own, freely and powerfully made, in the certain knowledge that she was, and always would be, a person of permanent value.